The following is a presentation of the Radio Misfits Podcast Network.
From the birthplace of modern winemaking, Sonoma, California, welcome to The Winemakers. Local experts Sam Couturi, Bart Hansen, and Brian Casey, along with host John Myers, invite you to listen in as they discuss all facets of winemaking. So sit back, pour yourself a glass, and let's hear what the guys have to say this week.
Well, a short mid-afternoon Sonoma pour.
Well, yeah. I mean, unfortunately, fortunately for me, I poured a little bit first before I remembered we needed a pour. So, cheers to that.
Yeah.
Welcome.
Absolutely. Hey, everybody. I'm John Myers. Welcome to The Winemakers. I'm with my friend Bart Hansen today. Brian is going to be right with us. And we are with Xavier Rolet from... Well, Chêne Bleu is how I know you in the Rhone region in France, and also Areni Global, which is a huge organization now that does nothing but help viticulture and agriculture worldwide. Congratulations and welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Enjoy.
It's a good way
Cheers.
to start a show. First time I've ever started a show with a fine glass of wine.
That's what you're supposed to do here at Sonoma. Well, you are on quite a seminar schedule here. How's the seminar going?
Yeah, they're working us really hard, but it's with great people. And being in Sonoma, I'd been to Sonoma before, but I've discovered a lot of things because unlike just a regular visit, you see a friend, visit the winery, we're really digging pretty deep into what is Sonoma and how old it is and the history and the varietals and the incredible array of viticultural philosophies and approaches. And so this trip has revealed to me the complexity and frankly the global contribution that Sonoma can make. And when you have that depth and richness and diversity of varietals going back 175 years, which some vintners are being outstanding at protecting and nurturing. This is not just a contribution to the economy of Sonoma, to the wine industry here, to the enjoyment of California-based consumers, maybe US-based consumers. It's a global contribution. And one of the things you find in the wine industry, what I certainly did find, although some of my family and relatives were already in the wine industry, well, it's like any business, it can be a bit competitive. It's also extremely cooperative, and it's very, very well connected globally. So people do care, and they're prepared to share. The producers, the sommeliers, the enologists, and actually it connects Sonoma to the rest of the world. In a way, wine is a little bit like traveling. When it's well made, you can drink a wine that really expresses what a particular region, what its geology, what its history, what its people are, the way wine is made, without having to travel. And I think the expression of the wines of Sonoma, particularly now that Sonoma has become, to my knowledge, the first viticultural region in the world to go fully sustainable and to go comprehensively sustainable. So everybody is signed up to that mandate. And I don't think this has been done anywhere else around the world. I could be wrong, but I believe, I'm pretty certain I'm correct. So this is a contribution not just to the consumers here, but it's also an example. I think it's part of the leadership. And for the rest of the wine industry, it gives you time to pause and say, why other people, maybe they're thinking of doing the same thing. And ultimately, it's going to help change the image of the wine industry, which sometimes, and correctly has been accused of, using too many chemicals, drawing too much of resources of the land. Regenerative agriculture, sustainable viticulture, working with nature, producing something that doesn't reflect the nature of the chemicals you put in the ground.
Right, absolutely.
But reflects the nature of the ground, of the region, of the climate, and of the people. And that's something special. It's just not like any, I think viticulture is special in that respect. And there is room for emotion. It's not just about the brands and the distribution. And we found this in Sonoma, and I think it's been so far a great experience.
So, to give credit where credit is due, what we have to thank to save all those varietals that are mixed in with the Zinfandel It's when white Zinfandel became popular in America in the 80s, because it's what kept all those old vineyards in production.
Yeah.
When I first started my career in the mid 80s, we made a white Zinfandel. I worked at Kenwood Winery, and it was primarily made of all old vine Zinfandel vineyards, and we made a small amount of red wine out of each of those vineyards, but the majority of it all went to rosé. And those vineyards are all still in production at this point, some 30 plus years later. So it really has done that. To your comments about other areas that have kind of dedicated their time to sustainability, yes, Sonoma County has done a very good job. We do wish that they included herbicides with that also, but we're just not there yet. As it's been explained to me in the past, it's a pathway towards that. And really, herbicides is one part of sustainability, as we know. But the Lodi area, which also has a lot of old vines.
Yes.
They have a pretty good commitment to it. There's also, conventionally farmed vineyards, huge acres there. But yeah, you're right. Sonoma, Lodi, and some other places coming on.
Paso?
It's been great. Yeah, Paso's been a little bit, everything's been a little behind, but there are certainly huge leaders in Paso. Tablas Creek, the Haas family has been, amazing with what they've done and what we're all learning from the work that they've done at Tablas Creek.
This is probably a question I should ask Morgan, but are there more Zin old vines than anything else?
Well, yeah, Zinfandel-based vineyards, and in those vineyards, yes, there's more Zin than anything else, but...
but do they make up the most,
yes,
majority of the old vines?
Yeah. For in California, yeah.
There's an incredible array of old vines, but the quantity is small. You mentioned Morgan Twain Peterson at Bedrock, and he's the master here in the region, and one of certainly the people that have promoted it. So Zin, of course, because of the statistical relevance of what was done, but when you look at the foundation, we were at Buena Vista this morning, and then the Hungarian immigrant who brought hundreds of different varietals. You find, besides the varietals that were already there, that were brought by the Spanish mission, for example, you find Counoise, you find Negret, you find, of course, the Mourvèdres and the Grenaches and the Roussins and the
And
Marsanne.
ferment.
Yes, and many others. And these have been kept, so statistically they're less relevant. However...
But they're very important.
They're very important because ultimately each, what we call terroir in French, which
Right,
I think
absolutely. That's
people...
the same thing here.
So the environment, the weather, the soil, the people that work it, the nature of the natural environment is going to be better suited for certain varietals and not so well for others. And you can't find that out in a new area. Back in the middle of the 19th century, California was a new viticultural area. You had to try a lot of things. And I think Zin, for example, which was overplanted and then was replaced with some of the sort of more fashionable, the Cabs and the others, succeeded in California because it's well suited. Rosé has taken off and many other things. So ultimately it's about a little bit of trial and error. It's finding what really works well. But if you don't start from a real diverse portfolio of options in a new area that has the advantage of being naturally beautiful, naturally rich, having a lot of potential, it's going to be difficult to find. And I suspect because in biology, just like in a natural environment, there's going to be some adaptation to local condition, whether you call it adaptation, whether you call it evolution. Within a subspecies, you're going to have some developments, including in the future, where certain varietals are going to be specific. In fact, they have specific California names, like some rootstock, St. George. But there's going to be things that are specific to California and that have not evolved, that have not adapted in the same way here as they had elsewhere.
Right.
So I do think there's a remarkable experience, and ultimately I share your comments, by the way, about herbicides. Where we are, and we're in a sort of middle altitude, a 9th century priory that was abandoned, that we've restored over several decades. We've eschewed the use of all herbicides, insecticides, fungicides, acaricides. We don't use chemicals in the winery either. We don't use tartaric acid. We don't use microplastics. I think the time is coming for the industry because there is concerns everywhere about the way we use natural resources, right? The way we exploit nature, and we can do it in a positive, we couldn't do it in a negative way. But I think the time is coming where viticulture is going to have to deal with the challenge of labeling. And there's already talks in Europe, I don't know if the same will happen in the United States, where on the label, on the back label, perhaps a wine bottle, the presence of chemicals, it could be residual herbicides, could be insecticides, could be the microplastics that some use to filter, to find their whites or their rosé. We'll have to figure on the label, and then consumers will have a choice. And if you look at the rest of the food and beverage industry, already everybody has to say what's, in the bottle, in the bag. So that's a challenge for the viticole industry. What I think was done in Sonoma was a good step because it makes it public.
Yep.
It's a commitment. It's a step in the right direction.
Yep.
I don't think it's the last step. But like in any race, if you start a little early,
Yep.
if you persevere, if you don't become complacent or lazy, you have an opportunity to remain, ahead of the pack. And I think that's the option and that's the opportunity. And I do agree with you. We really got to think about the damage we do to the soil by putting chemicals that kill the bacteria, that kill the microbiome, that make the soil less resistant to drought, to rain, to the changing climatic conditions. So there'll be those who believe in it and do it and try.
Yep.
They make mistakes, but on the way.
Yep.
And the others who resist change. And as always, there's always a moment where change is no longer an option, but becomes an obligation. And if you're not ready, you're not ready. You change business model or you change business.
Yeah.
It is interesting. So there are a number of wineries that have started. What they've started to do is put their ingredient list on.
Yes.
And I think we would probably credit Ridge to being the first one that started doing that.
Well, good for them.
There's been a number of smaller wineries, some friends of ours that do it, and it opens the book. Like, this is what we put in our wine. Period.
Exactly.
And there are things that they've put in that they would rather not because. 1 year you have to add a little bit of acid, so it goes on the label that year. Maybe you didn't ever do it, but it's about doing the right thing, right? And it's about being accountable, and that's the most important thing is that we're all accountable.
And
at least I feel
that accountability is ultimately a choice from consumers. So
Yeah.
to make a choice, you have to know,
Right.
And if there is proper disclosure, then consumers can make their own decisions. One of the I think that by nature the viticultural industry is rather static geographically.
Yeah.
We all know. You don't grow a vine in 2 years.
Right.
So you make commitments for many, many decades. And in terms of its own regulation, the so-called geographical origin systems, it's also quite a geographically inflexible form of agriculture. But now we got climate change, and climate change is accelerating. They're talking about an El Nino that could be one of the most extreme on record. That's on the way for this fall, this winter, and next spring. And so,
Unfortunately.
yeah, it's just the way it is. And we can discuss what climate change is, but I don't think this is a subject for today's discussion. But an industry that's based on agriculture and nature that depends so heavily on the weather, that is by nature inflexible geographically, and is dealing with climate change that is actually coming quite hurriedly and in a fashion possibly more brutal than what we expected. There's going to be a flight towards altitude. There's going to be a search for natural conditions that can help mitigate the droughts, the heat that reduce the maturation season. So you mentioned acid, for example. If you look at a lot of the rosés produced, for example, in my own country, in southern France. Southern France is the hottest region in France. Yet for rosé, you need freshness, coolness, acidity. And so almost by obligation, the vintners will put tartaric acid to restore that acidity. But that, of course, helps essentially degrade the organoleptic condition of the wine. So they tell you, with tartaric acid, you have to drink the rosé the year it's produced. That's the sort of orthodoxy. But without tartaric acid, a rosé will not last 50 years, but it can last 6, 7, 10, 12 years if it's well made. And the way to mitigate is probably not to look at putting tartaric acid, but to migrate the production of rosé to a much higher area where you have the natural freshness, coolness, thanks to altitude. And you can see where I'm leading with this is an industry that structurally is quite inflexible geographically is going to have to consider solutions to, if it wants to remain natural, a product that is actually good for your health. It's going to have to look at things that are difficult structurally to do. The largest, one of the biggest luxury company in the world, LVMH, the French, Louis Vuitton, Moet Tennessee, have a massive wine and spirit arm. And 7 years ago, they invested in viticultural land in Tibet at altitude between 2,200 and 2,600 meters. So you talk about above 7,000 feet. So these guys are thinking 100 years out, maybe 50 years out. But that tells you the trend. And so I think for producers here, the alternative ultimately to compensate for certain challenges that are imposed by nature with chemicals is going to be looking at different ways in different areas where to plant your vines, but also different ways to work the soil. Because if your soil is alive, if you have bacterial activity, if you can retain the moisture, retain through aerobic and aerobic bacteria, earthworms which are incompatible with the use of herbicides, as you mentioned, the use of other things, insecticides, you're going to have a vine that's more naturally able to resist this trend and still produce a good product that will give. Because wine, to me, it's not just about the satisfaction of some gustative desire. It's emotion. It's human social interaction. It's the social media of agriculture. You get around a good bottle of wine, you're going to share that emotion. It would be really sad if, for lack of adaptation, we lost the viticultural industry because we lost consumer support for the quality of the viticultural product. And then, what happens if all these vineyards go? What's going to replace them? There's going to be second homes from all over the place. There's going to be pockmarked with all sorts of constructions. It's part of a history. For those of you who are scripturally minded, remember the first thing Noah did when he got out of the ark? He planted a vineyard. What is the first miracle that it was done? It was converted water into wine. What did Paul say to his young follower Timothy? Drink a little wine for the sake of your stomach. This is part of our history, whatever your personal convictions are. It goes back thousands of years of recorded human history. So it's not just a product that gives you satisfaction. It's a social interaction. It's a sharing of human emotion. It brings people closer. Drunk in moderation, I'll readily concede. And it's different than just a good meal. It's really something special, I think, in the realm of human culture.
Yeah, I mean, a meal is different without wine.
Exactly.
And there are times in my own household, I'll ask my wife, "Are you going to have wine tonight?" And she's like, "No, not tonight." And I always have a glass. And it's funny, I usually change from stemware to a stemless glass if I'm drinking by myself for whatever reason it is, but it's just a glass. And it truly does enhance my meal. And I think, to your point also, it's the conversation that comes around a bottle of wine that's so important in our society.
We need more of it.
We need more of it.
Because right now, anger is everywhere.
Yeah.
And I don't want to get in trouble with the FCC, but it's
They
like
don't-
it's
they-
like
the FCC 's
platonic
not
love.
listening.
It's like platonic love. There's something missing, if you see what I mean. It's like a meal without wine.
Yeah.
Excuse the image.
No,
It's all okay. Believe me, we don't edit, and nobody cares because there
Okay.
is no FCC here.
All right.
So
Well, you're having me drinking wine here, so naturally,
That's a good thing.
the most of human emotions has to come out.
So, could you give us a little bit of background on the organization? I know it sounds to me like it was inspired from something that Nicole started.
Yes.
And in fact, it's been a number of years now. When I went back and started to kind of look at some of the articles that you guys have published or helped bring forward, it's been going on for a while. And if you could just give us a little background for our listeners so they can do their
Certainly.
own research.
As I said to John, I have to confess, since this is a friendly conversation, I'm in awe at this woman, Nicole, who, for some strange reason, agreed to marry me. Perhaps a moment of abandon. She co-created with another lady by the name of Pauline Vicard what is essentially a think tank. And the description of this mission is fine minds for fine wines. It's really getting a global community on a completely voluntary basis, something that started really initially with something that we did at our property in Provence at Chêne Bleu called a Grenache Symposium. We noticed that Grenache was one of the most heavily planted varietals in the world, but there was really no advocacy, no knowledge, no understanding of what beautifully cultured and cultivated Grenache could yield. So we brought people from all over the world, North America, Asia, masters of wine, producers, sommeliers, restaurateurs at Chêne Bleu in Provence. And we did a one-off. This was a 3-day event. It was an enormous amount of organizations. But as it concluded, because we'd had an opportunity to think of the future of fine wine, we thought, can we give this a little more structured approach? Could we meet once a year in different parts of the world? We've done it in Champagne. Now we're doing it in Sonoma. Next, I think it's going to be in Chile. We did it in South Africa. Could we meet with some of the vanguard, the most thoughtful, innovative, creative, sometimes irreverent wine producers, wine professionals, can be wine associations, people who are doing new things, who really understand the essence and the power of the wine culture, to share our experiences, but try to come up with practical initiatives that really ultimately are going to help the consumer. They're going to help the consumer appreciate what a fine wine is, the difference between a fine wine and just consuming alcohol for the pleasure and the joys of alcohol. And this initially was a lot of work. It started very modestly and is now growing into what I think is quite a relevant high end in terms of the quality of the wine, but a group of people who share the same passion. We talked about Morgan Train Peterson, for example. We had a wonderful opportunity also to spend time with the Jackson family here, with the Duttons. Nothing to do with the famous Yellowstone series, although maybe they would like to, I don't know. No one had to go to the train station after drinking a bit too much. These guys are doing things, and we're at the Buena Vista with Mr. Boisset's property here this morning. All these families are doing something because they believe in wine, and they're trying to innovate and do something different. And they like to share with like-minded producers, like-minded wine professionals, and they're not all of them very large. Some of them are very small, some of them mid-size, to deal with the challenges, access to permanent capital, the husbandry of the soil, the husbandry of the genetic material we've been entrusted with. How do we deal with an increasingly complex geopolitical environment? Trade tariffs. That always hits the consumer. At the end of the day, when there's trade wars, it's for certain the consumer pays. How do we deal with that? How do we deal with understanding the power and, frankly, the health benefits? I know there are some who think any alcohol in any quantity is bad. Well, many doctors, many scientists and biologists would disagree. So how do we represent the benefits, including mental? Mental health is today becoming a key concern. A very moderate consumption of very high quality wines that represent nature, that are here as an advocate of nature. There is a reason why this is the oldest form of recorded agricultural activity. It's been around for a long time. So Areni was really created not as a heavy bureaucratic, organization, but as a way to not only bring these like-minded professionals in the wine industry together, but do so regularly to try to, over time, move the dial, frankly, for the greatest benefit of consumers, so that they can appreciate what a great wine experience can be. That doesn't mean it has to be a $200 a bottle of wine. There are some outstanding. We tasted some wines from Georgia, Caucasus, not the American states. We're off to Chile, so we're going to look at next year. We look at Latin American wines. There's a wine culture everywhere in the world. It's striking. That's the purpose of Areni. It's really a convivial think tank that is trying to do good for the benefit of consumers and for the benefit of, frankly, a form of agriculture that is facing massive challenges and which future is not certain. Is not certain. Is not insured.
I mean, I think what I applaud you for is that I think a lot of people, when they think of a think tank, they think of a dark room with a bunch of powerful people sitting around in a circle deciding the fate of the world. And I say that sarcastically, obviously. But
we have no such pretension, that's for sure.
Right. But I think the important thing is that is proven here, and if you do the readings and see who's included, is really what you've done there is you've brought in the people. It's not just the people that are concerned with the industry, but you've included the people who are actually doing the industry.
Yeah.
And obviously that's very important, but a lot of times things like that are talked about, but you guys are succeeding in bringing the entire, literally from ground to consumption together.
Well, we're on our way. I mean, it's a lot of work, and it requires a lot of perseverance, and there's always skeptics. But as you start moving the dial and connect with more and more people, and then realize that, the vintners of Spain, of Chile, of here, California, of Italy, everywhere else, the folks that really care about the stewardship of the land they've been given, not the sort of greenwashing nonsense, but people who really care about their consumers, about what they've been entrusted to. They share the same issues, the same challenges. I mentioned some of them. And frankly, they'd like for the industry and its benefits and what it brings, the enjoyment that it brings to human society to be recognized. To a lot of people think the wine industry, or as you said, they're powerful people, they draw a lot of public money, subsidies. Nothing could be further from the truth. It's one, probably in terms of subsidies, and this is not a call for government to subsidize the wine industry, but it's one of the least supported, least subsidized, and most highly regulated form of agriculture. And so what viticultures are asking, I think, and I of course do not speak for all the industry, what I hear more and more is would like that the efforts that are made by certainly part of the viticultural industry to care about the soil. You're looking at cover crops, you're looking at composting, looking at no-till. This is expensive. This requires a lot of labor.
Absolutely, it does.
It's not something done cheaply. Is those efforts to be recognized? When you hear politicians that says, any alcohol in any quantity is bad. Well, science disagrees, and many doctors. It was Louis Pasteur himself, if I may quote a fellow Frenchman, if I can be forgiven, who said, wine is the most healthful and hygienic of beverages. Now, he wasn't completely incompetent in the area of biology. So again, it's about moderation. It's about the quality of your drink. If your glass of wine is full of chemicals, I would not certainly be an advocate of that. But it's part of human society, human culture, human experience. And what I think the viticultural industry that is working really hard, that is taking risks to migrate from chemical to regenerative agriculture, all they want is a little bit of love, a little bit of acknowledgement, a little bit of recognition, and not always the sort of weight of,
Well, it's going in that direction.
Well, I think that's good. I don't know if it's true everywhere, but if it's true in California, you guys are leading the world again, so congratulations.
It's funny. I just recently saw my cousins, and in my family, my mom's side of the family, they were all in the dairy industry.
Right.
And so the fourth generation of my uncle's ranch has come into the business. And the first to go to college and come back with a degree in agriculture. So at first they were, just starting the dairy. The next generation came in, they farmed conventionally. My cousins came in, my era came in, and they needed to turn organic because that's what made them profitable.
Yeah.
And that was a huge change for them, because they were never going to do that. Like, they thought people who were organic were crazy. Now they've done it. Now my cousin's son has come into the business fresh out of school, and he's digging pits out and analyzing the soil and trying to think, what can they do differently? And so obviously it takes generations to happen. But I guess my ending point is that my cousin said to me at the end of our conversation was, I just wish that people celebrated milk the way they celebrate wine. Nobody sits around and raises a glass of milk and I said, well, cheese.
Well,
and he said,
listen,
yes.
that might change too. I mean, when you look at the junk that, including some of the chemicals that and the hormones that are fed to certain cows,
Yeah.
and what ends up in your glass of milk, which probably makes you sick. Why do we have so many kids, 8, 9, 10-year-old, who have cancer?
Right.
Cancer is to a certain extent a self-imposed disease, given the chemically processed nature of a lot of the food that we eat. Wheat is another one, those gluten allergies. You had no allergies to spelt when wheat was produced
Right.
without chemicals. But to put that in a different context, I do think there's a growing awareness. It's different stages in America and around the rest of the world. And the point you made about shifting from chemical to regenerative organic agriculture, it's very risky for the farmer, because let's say you're sort of mid-sized family farm, you got some debt on the side, you've been farming a certain way, so there's some predictability if you use herbicides, insecticides, all sorts of synthetic things you put in the ground. There's some predictability to the yield you're going to get, and therefore to the economic outcome of that year's harvest. When you switch, the transition, which can be anywhere from 3 to 7, 10 years, means that there may be years where you lose part of your harvest, or where, as the soil is natural soil with bacteria and earthworms is being reconstituted, your crops have to change. You also may have to vary and diversify your production. That economically may be a cost that many farms a risk that they cannot take.
Right.
And so maybe I'll come back here in a year or two if it succeeds. If you'll have me again, maybe you won't after what I said today. But I'm working on a project to try to combine foundational and long-term impact investment with under a management company that would acquire derelict, disused, deeply damaged ranch land, agricultural land, could be also viticultural land, obviously not here in Sonoma and Napa, because it's quite expensive. Combine that with an academic institutions that would give the younger generations of farmers that, for either inheritance reason or lack of capital, cannot access their parents' farm because there's too many kids or simply they can't, and also an online farm to fork distribution mechanism, so that we can put with capital, medium to long-term capital, some disused land and make it available to young generations of farmers who have been trained, who are interested in bringing that land back to a productive status through regeneration. There's a capital gain to be made through distribution, online farm to fork, which is already starting to happen, and there are a number of organizations in the United States that are doing it quite extensively. It might surprise you to hear that biggest distributor of organic food in the United States today is Costco. Some people know, some people don't. But to see if we can marry these things, management, recuperation. America has probably lost, according to Kiss the Ground, the documentary, over 100 million acres of arable land. It may be even more than that. So you take
Lost
that
them
land,
to what? Poison?
desertification,
Oh, okay.
Essentially chemical farming that leads the land no longer be of use to anyone and being essentially abandoned. I also run a regenerative ranch in Montana, and I've seen that happen. But you can regenerate and bring these soils, almost even some of the most damaged soil, you can bring them back to life. So there is also capital gains. There's a value creation to be done, giving access to ownership and training to young generations of farmers, but also giving them better control over the processing and distribution, because many agricultural businesses suffer, in my opinion, from two things. Either a distribution that's super concentrated, So there's like one or two processors and distributors. So the producer has absolutely no pricing power. Look at the meat packing business, which over decades is concentrated into essentially 3 operators today, and look at the way consumer pays for increases, but producers get very little in terms of increases of the price paid to them for beef cattle, for example. And others are super fragmented. They have like layers and layers and layers of intermediaries. But in the age of internet, the age of direct communications, right? Radio, I was pleased to hear that radio is really growing in the United States. Why not offer to the consumer the benefits of a better product whilst leaving in the hands of the producers more of the value that they've created by taking the risk of producing genuinely regenerative, natural products that are not, excuse my French, but that are not full of junk, of processed chemicals. And the wine industry, I think, is in the same situation.
How far along are you on that project?
I'm getting started. I'm working with a few universities. I don't know which one I'll end up doing it with, because I also want a training in academic. One maybe in California, the other 2 on the East Coast. So I'll keep you posted. Right now, it's just an early stage project.
Well, that's a great idea. Well,
it might not work.
The seminar you're here doing now with Areni, I'm looking at your post online, and it is available online for free.
Yes.
You're talking about the future of consumer segmentation, long-term reputation, obviously, authenticity, and the role and place of wine education, securing the future of wine tourism, and securing the future of wines and vines. How is this seminar going? How's it being received? Who's attending, and what are they learning?
Well, in attendance, we have, I think, some of the most interesting luminaries in the California, particularly the Sonoma and Napa wine industry. So we have great producers, people who have really struck their own path. They've carved their own path forward with what they had. We have a lot of participants, representatives of Sonoma Growers Association. We have people from all over the world, from Latin America, from Europe, wine growers. Of course, the Areni folks that essentially are organizing the whole event. So it's really stakeholders at large. With, of course, a significant contingent of wine growers and winemakers, but if you look at who's there, they're not folks that within that industry are just happy to do whatever else does and sort of be, on the sort of slow train to we don't really know where. They tend to be, besides the passion, it's almost a requisite to be part of this. And everybody will say I have passion for what I do, but they also have a passion for improvement and innovation. And on the production side, it's quite complex. If you manage a winery, you've got to be an organic chemist. You've got to understand soil chemistry. You've got to be a manager. You've got to manage capital and capital raising. You got to manage the geopolitical impact of protectionist decisions. You got to manage the communication aspects. It's really an extremely complex and varied set of qualifications to be successful. So these are the folks that join, but folks that are also interested fundamentally in cooperating. Yes, everybody's out there to sell their wine and do as well as they can for their families and for their employees. Employees are very important. But they're also folks who will not let the natural instinct that we all have for a little bit of competition, a little bit of, desire to shine or desire to do well, will not let that stand in the way of cooperating for the greater good. And that's what really unifies us. And I think it's going well. To answer the other part of your question, we've gone through most of the working sessions. So there's been now, on all the questions, all the points that you just showed me, a set of proposals, a set of analysis, a set of, in some cases, decisions and things that we seek to carry to the next year and see how we've done. Because otherwise it's just thoughts on a board or on a website. And the people that are there, there's not tens of thousands of us, but they're relevant, I think, opinion makers in the industry. And they do want to make their mark. So we're hopeful that at least a few of these things will ultimately be impactful to the viticultural industry.
Well, they're all extremely relevant right now.
We believe they are, yes, but thanks for confirming it.
Well, that's what we deal with every week on here. You know, how do you market? How do you brand? How do you grow? You know, how do you create? And lowering your impact
Yes.
on the environment. I mean, we've gone through things, you know, using thinner glass, less packaging and plastic, all kinds of different things,
Yeah.
especially soil health.
Soil health is very important. You know, for example, tilling. Those who've studied history will remember that North Africa once was the wheat basket of the Roman Empire, feeding millions of people. Today, North Africa is a desert. And why is it a desert? Because the climate has not changed significantly. You still see the old Roman force sitting on top of hills in now completely desert-covered parts of Tunisia and Libya and Egypt because of hundreds and hundreds of years of tilling. When you till, you destroy the bacterial structure of the soil. So no tilling, reinforcing through composting, through cover crop, what is going to bring nutrients. You know, the organic layer sits between gases, the air, where you get snow, nitrogen, air, rain, and the rock mass. Now, people talk often about the mineral qualities of a wine, which it's true. Wines can reflect the geological, the subformation of the soil. But the vines, the roots of a vine will not extract minerality directly from the rock mass. They need an organic layer, a live organic layer full of aerobic bacteria that are close to the surface because they need oxygen, anaerobic bacteria that are further down who are adverse to oxygen, who can convert those minerals into elements that can be assimilated and essentially ingested by the roots. So without an organic layer, whether it's a foot deep or whether it's 3 or 5 feet deep, which is live, full of earthworms, full of bacteria that process these chemicals, your wine is never reflect the true geological condition of the soil. It will reflect the chemicals you put in there. It will reflect the synthetic fertilizers you put in there. But you don't need to synthetically fertilize your vine if you have a live soil. For example, we use sheep. So they come during the winter, they leave their droppings, they graze the grass, and then they leave in the spring. And after a few years, creates a very, very rich organic and bacterial life. All the refuse from the sewage from the winery. Wineries generate a lot of acidic.
Yes, we do.
Exactly. And actually, because, you know, as you know, at Chêne Bleu, we also have a little hospitality structure and a little hotel. We mix, no, it's not the most pleasant thing to discuss, but let's talk about it because we talk about sustainability. Human sewage and acidic sewage from the winery. And we're using, for example, a technique that's very well known in China. None of the sewage that we produce gets back into the ground, gets back into rivers. We're completely autonomous. We have an isolated bamboo plantation with very thick plastic liners underneath and on the side. As you know, bamboos essentially grow through rhizomes, through roots. And so at night, 3 o'clock in the morning, we spray all that mixture onto our bamboo plantation. The rhizomes essentially suck it up, grow the bamboos. We then harvest the bamboos for other needs. You can't even smell it. You can really put your nose in the bamboo forest. You will not be able to smell the sewage. Nothing goes into the ground. Nothing goes into public sewage system. Nothing goes into rivers. There's just one element, but there's so many things. We use bees, for example, for pollination, for pollination help, for cover crops. And we're actually studying with the French National Agronomical Research Institute and the local university the impact that bees could have on pollination. Now, the received wisdom is vines are entirely self-pollinating. And we're actually, we've been doing this for 3 years. We're starting to think, based on the data received, it's scientific analysis, and there are far more eminently qualified scientists than me who have done this, we're starting to see a beneficial impact on areas where vines and cover crops are pollinated and covered by bees in terms of the yeasts that are the natural yeasts that are on the skin and inside the berries, in areas that are accessible to the bees versus other areas which for several years we've netted so we can compare. So this is also experimentation and research. So soil management is the basic foundation. You need to have a soil that is alive. When you drive by sometimes some of those cornfields or wheat fields or any fields, in period of drought, the earth is all cracked up. Right. But when you got a heavy rain, you've got these really, deep puddles everywhere. These are the signs of a soil that's dead, right, where there's no ability by the organic layer to process water or resist to drought. So having a live soil is the beginning. I think, for example, the work that Morgan at Bedrock does in terms of his varietals, now that he has restored a number of properties to sustainable live soil, regenerative agriculture, looking at the incredible genetic complexity that the viticultural industry has frankly developed over the last 5,000 years. Now, I know that certain things, like people will like their Pinot or will like their Cab, but there are thousands of varietals, of wine varietals all over the world. So attempting to, for example, match certain varietals that may long have been forgotten with the new conditions of drought or excessive heat or lack of altitude in some areas. There's an enormous library of genetic diversity that I think more innovative viticulturists can use to try to also address challenges like climate change. It's there. It's all out there. So the reduction of genetic diversity in one or two particular forms of viticultural production, it's like corn, it's like wheat, it's like the beef cattle industry that I happen to know a little bit. Everybody wants to do black Angus, wants to do red Angus. We're up in the mountains of Montana, 7,000 feet. The Scottish Highlands do great. By the way, it's the oldest known species of cattle on record. So can we also try to rediscover a little bit of diversity? Because it's also a tremendous help against disease, against viruses. When you see these enormous areas of monoculture, it's the same varietal for miles and miles and miles and miles. And there's not a blade of grass in between the rows. And then you get spores that carry viruses, that carry cryptogams, little mushrooms. And over square miles upon square miles, there's just one varietal and nothing else. That's what's getting attacked. So it's also a strategy of diversification and risk management.
Come on over, Brian.
I'm in the middle of
drinking Chêne Bleu.
Are you kidding? I can talk about Chêne Bleu for hours. No idea. There's a farm in Marin County. We say here locally, but it's in Marin County called Stemple Creek.
Okay.
And I'll send you
Stemple Creek. I've not heard of them, but love to
and
visit.
Regeneratively maybe. Farmed cattle ranch,
they've got great beef.
Yeah. And it's amazing the work that he's done. And I'll send you, people have heard us talk about it before, but you might find it fascinating, especially since you're kind of looking into that. But very closely grazing, in a compact area and then moving the cattle through. And
exactly
what he's done to the soil, the way he's changed the soil, that for generations was exactly what you said, cracked, flooded, and it's completely changed it.
That rotational grazing, the scientific foundations were led by a gentleman from Rhodesia called Alan Savory, who actually now has a Savory Institute in the United States. And again, it's the observation of nature. He observed in southern Africa that herds of millions of wild animals, wildebeest, zebras, would migrate through the savanna. And of course, when they landed somewhere, they grazed it to the ground and they broke up the soil. And then they moved on, and those areas had the richest, most diverse, and healthiest prairie. Why? Because the surface of the soil was broken, so it would ingest the rain, the gases. Gases are very important for nutrition, for plant nutrition. But it will also graze the plants to essentially to the ground, but the recuperation period was very long. Yeah. And so in modern ranching management, since World War II, the technique was the opposite. Let's say you had 20, 30,000 acres, you computed the number of AUMs, that's the cow, calf, pairs, and say, okay, I've got 20,000 acres, I can put, 600 cow calves pairs, and I'm going to let them loose from spring until fall. And what happens is the cows, they graze the crown of grass. And then they come back randomly, and 2 or 3 weeks later, they graze it again, and they graze it again. And after a few years and decades, the grass won't grow back. Because what the grass requires, once it's been grazed down, and being grazed down is good, is a long recuperation period. Ideally, 1 to 2 years minimum. That's how the old prairie, that's how the old Midwest savanna was like. So it doesn't surprise me to hear that that particular farmer you mentioned that I wasn't aware of is using that same technique, concentrated grazing in small areas. And you move it along quickly, you leave it a few days, maybe a week or two, and it won't return for a while. That's what produces a very, very healthy prairie. And the best combination, actually, that we've seen is doing that together with forms of agricultural and cereal production. So you can actually mix stock growing with traditional agriculture if you do it in certain conditions, because of course it helps bring back a lot of the compost and a lot of, the reason we use sheep at La Verrière, at Chêne Bleu, is because of that fertilization and that grazing. But again, they don't come back for a year.
Right.
So
They're very
I'm not
popular
surprised
here.
to hear that farmer is doing well.
They rent sheep around here.
Yeah.
We've had there's been more sheep in Sonoma and Napa counties in the last year than there have probably been total in the last 10 years. It's really, people have really grown to it. And I think also with the fire danger, the Sonoma County Parks Department has integrated
They encourage
goats
that.
and sheep, and made huge differences, because what's worse is a completely ungrazed piece
Absolutely.
of land, right, where there's no
Absolutely.
competition, the invasive weeds take over. And we know that weeds will change also, right? Constant. There are weeds that will have adapted to live through herbicides.
They absolutely do. And, if you look at, let's say, a pasture, in fact, in Montana, I work with some local First Nations, particularly Crows and the Flathead, who have been practicing ritual, very concentrated, technically smart burns for thousands of years.
Yes.
If you let grass grow in an area, let's say a high altitude pasture, and it is never grazed, so the grass will grow, will dry up, it'll grow again, get rid of snow. After a decade, 10, 15 years, the surface of the soil is covered with a thick matting of dead grass that prevents rain, snow, nitrogen melting from the snow, and seeds from getting into the soil. Essentially, it's almost like an insulation. So wild grazing in the old patterns, like buffaloes, bisons in the American plains, or wildebeest, actually is essential in the regeneration of the soil, because it breaks up the surface, mixes the nutrients. But what the grass needs is a long recuperation period. If the grass is routinely and repetitively and randomly grazed every 2 or 3 weeks, then the crown will die.
Right.
And that's really the way the American prairie used to work. And you can with modern regenerative agriculture, and sheep in particular. If you ask Morgan at Bedrock, he'll tell you, because he's done the scientific analysis. It's not just the pretty picture for sort of regenerative tourism. The type of fertilizer that the sheep will leave is particularly well suited to viticulture. It's a rich fertilizer. It requires a long period of degradation. Frost actually helps, so it doesn't decompose very quickly, so the release is also pretty slow. And then you can measure, we've done it for many decades, for several decades now, Chêne Bleu.
Yeah.
You can measure the increase in the richness of the microbiome and the nutrients there. And so, farming and stock growing, they're really meant to go together if you've done right.
Yeah.
You're absolutely spot on that particular point.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, this this is so much information, and there's so much to learn.
Well, you're serving me wine. What do you expect?
Well, it's a perfect day to have, just sit out here. This is pretty much the nice day in Sonoma.
Good.
And,
So, Could a little bit off this subject, but also still very important. Can you kind of give us an update on what's going on in your part of France viticulturally in the growing season this year?
Yeah.
Here we're very far behind and
or very
it's been
far ahead.
cold,
Depends which way you look at it.
Right, exactly.
And the drought. I mean, last year the Loire vanished.
Oh no, France in general and Europe last year suffered grievously. Provence, the south where we are, had essentially a 3 month drought, not a drop of rain, but with temperatures in the hundreds and above. So in that environment, being high up, although not a perfect solution, made a huge difference.
Right.
Because your vines at some point, if the drought is extreme, particularly if your soil is not healthy, if you don't have a little bit of relief at night when the temperatures drop, eventually the vine, even if you cultivate it regeneratively, which sadly few people do, certainly in France, the vine will essentially get blocked to the maturation process. Bordeaux had all these wildfires. It's not just the drought, not just the heat. You've had quite a bit of that here too. And fire and smoke, of course, affects the organoleptic qualities of your wine because the smoke, the carbon, the soot is deposited on the skin. So we are going to see more and more of that. I don't want to get into a lengthy conversations, but since you've plied me with wine, I'll give you maybe a little look into some of the recent science that's come out in the area of climate change, because the obsession is CO2, and there's no doubt CO2 is a contributor to climate change. But many scientists today are saying, who are not funded by business or by governments, that actually CO2 is a very small contributor to climate change, is a marginal contributor to climate change. What is impacting climate change, and I think we're going to see it this winter with El Nino, if indeed it is an extreme El Nino, is we're coming out of 3 years of back-to-back La Nina, which is very unusual. And the year before, we already had an El Nino. So El Nino, La Nina 3 times, and El Nino. That combination is also increasing layer. What they're saying is, and this is where I think viticulture can help, but also agriculture in general. It is the chemical pollution of the oceans, the release of microplastics, the release of forever chemicals, the release of PFAS, a whole range of certain types of chemicals, not all chemicals, that destroys what they call the surface micro-layer of the oceans. And the Pacific Ocean, being the largest, is of course the most influential in terms of weather. And actually the United States, China, India, Australia, the US, and Latin America are the most impacted, of course, by changes in atmospheric patterns over the Pacific Ocean. That surface micro-layers, which is about 1,000 microns, about a millimeter thick, does 2 things. First of all, it feeds phytoplankton. Phytoplankton is essentially the foundation of all the nourishment that goes into zooplankton and goes into marine biology. According to their estimates, half of the world's phytoplankton is gone since 1970. And phytoplankton, according to the models I've seen, and it's not just one scientist, historically has produced about 70% of the oxygen that our planet relies upon. So trees play an important part, but a minor part.
We're done.
Okay. No, well, you can. I'm happy to stop if you wish.
No, go ahead.
But there's a solution to this. And what they're saying is the second thing is the surface micro-layer, besides being the vital foundation of essentially all the food that comes out of the ocean. And many scientists today will tell you in a region 1/2 to 2/3 of existing life in the marine environment is already gone, and we're not talking about 5%. But the other very important impact that a healthy surface micro-layer can have is it acts as a thermal regulator of the oceans. And here's what they believe is the number one factor powering climate change. Not CO2, unimportant, but really minor compared to that first element. Methane comes third, and then you have black carbon and soot. They believe it's water vapor. It's essentially the Pacific Ocean and other oceans accelerating rates of evaporation that creates climate. We're talking about climate change here. And all these atmospheric rivers we've had hit California. Brighton, Utah this year received 850 inches of
Good
snow.
Lord.
That's 25 meters for those who compute in metric system. This is a record. We don't have anything like that. So climate is indeed already out of control. The good thing is that if we stop producing specific class of chemicals, and in the viticultural industry, a lot of producers of whites and rosés in particular use microplastics to find their wine. It's called polyvinyl, polypyrrolidone, PVPP. Now, that is a microplastic. They say it's not lethal. It's not. It goes into your stomach. It ends up in the river. It ends up in the seas. But in the seas, together with many other chemicals, it impacts the phytoplankton. So, you look at sustainable viticulture. It's in the ground, but it's also in the winery. You can use bentonite. You can use organic green pea powder. You can use many other completely organic and natural alternative rather than microplastic. So there's things, and that's not going to change the economics of the wine industry. So why do we continue to knowingly not always, but mostly, certainly in a part of what scientists are telling us, products that do nothing for the taste, do nothing for the product experience, and actually hurt the environment. Yeah. So that's the sort of thing that Areni, for example, looks at. Are there things that we can do to change our ways, make it known? Because in the context of climate change, if we get the extreme El Nino that many scientists, including the NOAA, are telling us is on the way, that's going to be a very difficult year. And the countries that will suffer will be India, will be China, will be Australia, and the weather patterns in the southern United States, probably California, Texas, and the sort of southern East Coast, will be impacted. The Northwest will probably do a little bit better. But they also say that if we stop releasing these pollutants in the oceans, phytoplankton has the ability to repair itself very quickly, just like regenerative agriculture. I mean, we're not talking about 3 months, but a dozen years could make a big difference. So why not do it? And so even if on a small scale, we in the viticultural industry can start moving away from chemicals we don't need, why not do it either? After all, it's a little bit, every little bit can help.
It's the right thing to do if we want to live here anymore. Like I was saying,
Very early in my career.
Well, it's really for our children and grandchildren, right? Because for us,
absolutely.
we've part of our life is behind us already.
Right. My son will be very quick to point out that it's our generations that have messed this all up, and now we're relying on them to fix it all.
He's not wrong.
And it's funny that you mentioned I haven't thought about PVPP in a long time, but
it's just one of them.
Yeah. Oh no. Right. But just like I can remember using it and just thinking like, what is this?
Yeah,
and it's everywhere. And even if you wore your respirator, you could taste it, and it was just everywhere. And we used to dump it in the wine,
So you can use things that are natural,
that
are not going to impact the organoleptic qualities of your wine. And more importantly, I mean, for us at Chêne Bleu, we use organic green pea powder.
Yeah.
And there's other solutions. But for us, it works well because we have our own bees, we have our own garden, and we have access to organic producers in the Rhone Valley. Why not do something else? I mean, it's in a way, it's a little bit of a, in my view, a little bit of a laziness, because you got a problem with your land, so you buy all these chemicals, and then the guy shows up and says, "Oh, by the way, I've got this for this, and I've got that for that," and the list goes on and on and on, and after a while, it's just a habit. Right. Okay,
and
that's human nature. Okay, yeah.
And here's a hat from my chemical company. No. We always have a joke that you can tell a little bit about your farmer by the type of hat that he's wearing, because There you go.
We have such a variety of information here, and there's no way we can do this in an hour. I promised Nicole that I would have you out of here at 5 minutes after 3, so we've got about 10 minutes to really wrap up.
Yeah.
So what are the most important things that you want to communicate to our audience, which is a mixture of consumers and wine professionals and growers and producers?
Well, as a wine, all right, I might not give myself the qualification professional, but certainly as a wine stakeholder and a co-manager. It's really Nicole who does all the work. As a co-manager of a winery, I'm also a consumer. So my perhaps parting comment would be really directed at the consumer, because the consumer is a customer, the consumer is a client. And it is really ultimately, we discussed, for example, the futures of the vines, the futures of the industry. It is really in their hands. All of us, by the way, not there, some amorphous blob somewhere. It's the individuals today. We all have, to a certain extent, given our ability to consume, our ability to spend a bit of money on some products, we all have the ability, because there's so much information available, and frankly, probably too much. As far as wine is concerned, there are certain media, vehicles, for example, like your podcast, some apps that give the consumer the ability, if they would like to maintain one of the oldest form of cultural and social expression, and oldest form of agricultural humanity that we have, if they want to try and improve it, if they want to try to exercise their buying power, even if it's limited, even if they buy a bottle every now and then, do take the time, because also, in my view, it's fun. There's so much today that's available. Try to connect into, it could be an app, listen to a podcast, to sort of almost educate yourself, learn about the industry, and make a difference. When you see a product, when the small producer has been looking at very old varietals, making the efforts to regenerate his or her land, to avoid the use of chemicals in the winery or in the soil, you can vote. It's almost like an election. At the end of the day, it's in your hands as a customer. You can vote if you're going to encourage or discourage that kind of thing. What kind of health, what kind of environment, what kind of society do you want? That would be my only humble suggestion. We all have a little bit of power in our hands, and if everybody seeks to exercise it, that doesn't mean we're going to get it right all the time. We can actually change many things about the way agriculture, which has been run really as an adjunct of the chemical industry, in my humble opinion, we can run it differently. We can change things, and it will be for the healthcare benefits, maybe not of us, but of our children. Yeah. It will be for the benefits of the planet, because these things are not irreversible. These things can be changed. And change is difficult. It comes with great difficulty to humankind, because once we're down a groove, it's comfortable. But I think the joy of learning about something, I could say, go out and learn about different kinds of corn and different kinds of wheat and different kinds of carrots, your regenerative carrots versus a non-regenerative carrot. All of this you can do. But wine is so special. Wine is a social way of connecting with the rest of humanity. There's so much that some would like to use today to separate us, to make us feel angry at each other. Wine cuts across that. Share a very good bottle of wine with 5 or 6 strangers. Forget about friends. And you'll find that at the end of that experience, they're not strangers anymore.
They are friends, yeah.
Don't we need a little more of that?
Absolutely.
So exercise, in my view, my humble suggestion, exercise the power that you have to educate yourself a little bit about what makes fine wine, what makes regenerative wine, what makes good wines, because it's the passion, not just the activities, not just the desire for commercial recognition. It's the passion of its producers, and I do think you will get a little bit of enjoyment and greater fun out of doing so.
Wow, I mean, what a great spot to end
Really?
This episode
Right.
of the Winemakers Podcast, and we will hopefully get to do this again with you sometime down the road.
Well, I'll let you know how we get on with my project.
And
I'll
we
come
will
back.
Yeah.
be talking with Nicole about
couple weeks.
Chêne Bleu specifically.
Great.
And what a beautiful spot in this world that you have there. I mean,
It's a beautiful spot here, too.
it is.
You
but
can't complain.
You are in such a little island there up in the mountains.
Yeah.
It's just you. I hear you lost the blue oak tree?
Yeah, I mean that oak tree had been it died of senescence. It was over 300 years old, and we had painted it with copper sulfide to protect it with stripped
Blue
it from
tree,
the bark.
right.
And we thought it was going to last 4 or 5 years. It lasted 15 years as a dead tree. But we're now, and Nicole will give you more details, engaged in an artistic project with a fantastic Italian artist to try to, that tree had been there a long time, and it symbolized for us that old property. The property was built in the 9th century. It was 1,100 years old. It was a priory. It was a Templar farm, Templar establishment.
Great plumbing, I'm sure.
That tree for us was a way to bring it back to life. It was dead, had been abandoned for many, many decades. So we gave that tree a second life. Now we want to give it a third life, but it will be an artistic inspiration. I'll let Nicole tell you more about
Sounds
it,
great.
because it's who we are, that tree.
Bart, any shout-outs before we go today?
No, tickets are available for the Sonoma Valley Vintage Festival the last weekend of September. Right now you can get tickets for the grand tasting and for the dinner before online at SonomaValleyWines.com. I would also like to say that we have this weekend, that will pass by the time this goes up, the Rhone Rangers tasting out at Klein Winery. But the other thing is going along with International Grenache Day on September 17th. We are celebrating here in Sonoma Valley with a couple of events, and so stay tuned for more details about that. Because we do love our Grenache here in Sonoma.
That was
also.
another Nicole creation, International Grenache Day.
Yes.
I like
That
it.
woman is...
Well, we celebrate it, believe me.
Yeah.
Or
That woman is
Grenache
incredible.
Month here, basically.
Yeah.
Keep in mind, she's a New York raised and born lady who worked in New York City all her life, and then discovered through, her fate making her become my wife. She discovered viticulture.
Yeah.
A little over 20 years
Well,
ago.
we're glad you guys got together, because we wouldn't be here without that. So.
All right.
Well, she's an incredible lady, and I think she deserves a lot of
So
credit
we
for
shall
this.
continue the Chêne Bleu story. And Areni.com
Yep.
available. That's it. And
Yep.
anybody can look it up. The seminar is going on now in Sonoma, and you can get a summary online for free. Just go to Areni.com, and it's actually...
And there are so many podcasts linked to it, and so many
Yes.
articles written on the article. The website is a great resource, and so we will post that with the show for everybody to follow along with that, because there's a lot of information.
And so it's actually Areni.global.
Yes.
Okay, there we go.
Yeah.
And
Why not be ambitious?
and what we're talking about is ensuring the future of fine wines. You can get it right there online with everybody access. So, all right. Well, thank you so very much for coming
Thanks
on
for
this
having me on
afternoon.
your show.
I'm really sorry
See
that
you
we
in 2
only,
years' time.
we only had an hour plus, but that's it.
Great.
So, all right. Thanks, Bart.
We'll see you next week.
Thanks for listening, everybody. We'll talk to you next week.